So we're here reviewing the Wells Fargo Championship where Wyndham Clark wins it for the first time. Here are the results for 2023. Clark beat out Schauffele by 4 shots. It was fun. It was fun watching. I mean, there was a point where actually Xander got to -16 and Clark was at -15. I think that was like hole 6 or 7, something like that. So the fact that Wyndham came back and won by 4 shots is pretty impressive, especially for his first win at a pretty difficult golf course. So yeah, -19 was your winning score. It was like perfect weather most of the time. Like I would say it was perfect weather. Sure, there might have been some wind gusts that came up and certain parts of the day were windy, but this was pretty good. Wyndham Clark is your winner. I'm not going to go over the full breakdown. Just want to show you who first and second place were and kind of a little summary of what I got to watch. So that was great. Now, what I like to do in these reviews is just review the SweetSpot process. I don't necessarily so much care who won the tournament as much as I do what I covered in the strategy and preview video. Did it actually come to fruition during this week's tournament? So the first thing I like to look at basically is the summary page, or the bucket system, which gives me an idea of, of my projections that I covered in the preview and strategy video, which I will be doing in the preview video for the AT&T Byron Nelson, which this is being clipped from. I will be covering, or I covered the projections, and of those projections, this column here tells me were those successful projections. So during my preview videos, when we go over every single projection and I'm telling you, hey, play no more than 2 golfers from the last year 1 bucket, and then that comes out to be true, well, you could have skipped out on 19 golfers if you had not played any of them. And you might be tempted to play them because they might be good golfers. But the bucket system takes into account a lot of pieces of information. It takes into account the success rate. So I track this for every single tournament. What's the likelihood that a golfer from those buckets finishes inside the top 10 just based off of what we've seen in previous years? Not only does it cover that, it covers how many golfers are in that bucket this year. It also kind of I will say the projections don't take into account the average per year, but you can use your eyeballs to see, this year versus on average. It also puts into account strength of field. So the projection includes success rate, how many golfers are in that bucket, as well as the strength of field points. And it creates the projection off of that, which it's been pretty successful. Like I've never seen anything lower than 31 out of 36 buckets. This week, we're 36 out of 36 buckets correct. You can see a no here, and we'll discuss this here shortly. But yeah, all buckets were successful. One thing to note, though, we didn't really go over the last year buckets because last year, this tournament, the Wells Fargo Championship, was played at TPC Potomac. This year, Quail Hollow. So I didn't include last year's stats. Technically, no one played last year at Quail Hollow, except for those at the President's Cup, but we're not including that. So technically that bucket was successful. The last year buckets were successful, but we won't count that. But 30 out of 30 buckets. So we exclude the last year buckets. We include everything else. Every other bucket was successful. Now, the one that you see a no here, on the optimizer, I had this projection. You can see here it says 1 to 2, like 1.25 to 2.08. We always round up with this one, and we always round down with this one, right? Those are the rules. So when we round up to this is 3, and we round down with this, that's 1. So I would be telling you 1 out of 3. Done this long enough that I know there has to be like a little safeguard in there. And that's where this column over here, this max projection column over here, this incorporates the SweetSpot score. So the SweetSpot score is my model, essentially, and it ranks all the golfers based off of the model. And then when you incorporate that into the projection, it will either raise it or lower the max projection. And you can see the differences between the two. 2.08, 1.88. So what I do with this information is I copy it over to the optimizer, but because this max projection is 2 when we round up, I want a 2-point buffer between the max projection and the min projection. So when this is just 2, got to cut it down to 0. So then when I look at it as a whole, this is actually 0 to 3 is what my projection ends up being. And that's all because of the little safeguard that's in there. And the reason I haven't really fully incorporated the SweetSpot score into the projections is primarily it's kind of a trial and error scenario for me. But what I've also come to realize, what I think is wonderful, is when I have this max projection lower than this one, it forces me to lower the minimum, but still have that full maximum of 3. So basically it forces me to push the minimum down to a 0, but it still allows me to have 3 for my max projection, which means that that bucket is a very volatile bucket. 3.68% success rate. There were 54 golfers in it. So that was like, well, it's a volume driven bucket. There's a chance, obviously, at least one golfer is going to finish inside the top 10. But because it's such a volatile bucket and our SweetSpot model isn't showing us really any golfer of quality from this bucket, we bump down that minimum to 0. So I think forever, I am going to have my normal min and max, and we will always have this conservative one over here to let us know if we need to bump down the minimum. And obviously, this being a 0 to 3 projection, there were 0 golfers in the top 10, the optimal lineup, or the SweetSpot optimal. So therefore, this bucket is successful because it still matches inside that projection of 0 to 3 with 0, obviously. So it hits. I hope that wasn't too confusing, but it's just like my safeguards when it comes to these projections. It's all formula driven. You know, call it an algorithm if you want. But I think, again, no matter what, I will always have it this way. So 0 to 3 was the projection. Why it's not showing a Y here is because I don't have everything that I just everything that I just mentioned. That's not built in to the formula that drives this to be a Y or an N. And I personally don't care to change it. Sure, it would be lovely to see, all green, but this also gives me an opportunity to be transparent with you and let you know how these projections work, why it's successful, and the whole thought process that goes behind it. So bucket system, 100% successful. So the bucket system successful. The last thing to talk about with the SweetSpot process are the Marquee Tee Times. But before we get into that, I just want to go over the pass optimal and GPP winning lineup that came from the Wells Fargo Championship. So your optimal lineup left $1,200 on the table. And it included Xander Schauffele at $10,700. And then it went 8K, Tyrrell Hatton, 7K, Wyndham Clark, 7K, Harris English, 7K, and Adam Scott. If you were with me in the strategy videos, that was a golfer I really liked, was Adam Scott. And then $7,400 Denny McCarthy. That all equals $48,800. And it also, by the way, scored 652 points. Your GPP winning lineup scored 624. So there was a 28-point difference between the two. And your GPP winning lineup used up almost all $50,000, $49,900. And those are all the golfers here in blue. So that includes Xander at 10, $9,100 Sung J M. Then it was a ton of 7K golfers. Corey Connors at 79, Wyndham Clark at 78, Adam Scott at 73, and Harris English at 71. So that was a 10K golfer, a 9K golfer, and 4 7s. That were your GPP winning lineup. Now, that's all fine and dandy, 28 points. Now, if you're following the SweetSpot process completely, and maybe I should have included Marquee Tee Times into this. I should. Okay, next week I'll do that because it makes sense. SweetSpot Optimal, I run at the end of the tournament, I run the optimizer with all of the DK points that were awarded throughout the event to find out if you follow the SweetSpot process, which includes the Marquee Tee Times, which I should have included, as well as the bucket system, can we build a lineup that still beats the GPP winning lineup? SweetSpot Optimal that I had for this week was it scored 631.5 points. Your GPP winning lineup scored 624. So we would have taken down a GPP had we went with the following golfers. $10,000 Xander Schauffele, $9,100 Sung J M, $8,500 Tyrrell Hatton, 776. That's your 1098 776. Booyah. We would have taken down the GPP winning lineup following the Sweet Spot Optimal. Now, I do have to confess, there was a better Sweet Spot Optimal that scored 639 points, but I think I had to drop down my salary to $49,000 because I think it left $1,000 on the table or $800 on the table, one of the two. And I think it was like a 10K golfer. It actually might have been a 10, 9, and then 4 sevens, something like that. Just like how the optimal lineup was. That's difficult to do. And I always advocate for the 1098 776. So there you go. We were able to build a 1098 776. It incorporates everything that the Sweet Spot process does, and it still would have taken down a GPP. So I thought it was safe, it was smart, simple, left $200 on the table. Now, the one other piece that goes with the Sweet Spot process are the Marquee Tee Times. So if I slap a filter on here and we sort it by the group rank basically tells us what our Marquee Tee Times are. So every third golfer basically is a group, or every 3 golfers that I'm highlighting here is a group. Basically what I do is I look at the top 9 groups in the field, and this is all based off the Sweet Spot score. I cover this in the strategy videos. Based off the Sweet Spot score, we figure out our Marquee Tee Times. These are the best, the top 9 groups in the field that are paired together. The rule is never pair up, basically choose 2 to 4 groups. Pick 2 to 4 groups in the Marquee Tee Times and only 1 golfer from those groups. So again, to remind you, choose 2 to 4 groups, and out of those groups, just pick 1 golfer. And that's what you build your lineups around. You don't, very rarely do we have 2 golfers from the same group in an optimal lineup or even in a GPP winning lineup. I can already see there is one with a GPP winning lineup, but when we look at this with your optimal lineup golfers, we had Xander Schauffele. These little black tick marks are optimal lineups. We had Xander Schauffele, Adam Scott, Harris English, and Tyrrell Hatton out of all of the Marquee Tee Times. So there's 4 golfers, and they were in the optimal lineup. That's not me finagling with the data, nothing like that. Basically, what I just covered in the optimal lineup versus the GPP winning lineup, you can see right here. 4 golfers from the Marquee Tee Times. Remember, I always say choose 2 to 4 groups. 2 to 4 groups and 1 golfer from each of those groups to be in your lineups. Because the Marquee Tee Times, it's like 90% clip that we see this. 90% of the time we see 2 to 4 golfers from the Marquee Tee Times in the optimal lineup. And there we have it. We have it. Xander's 1. Scott is 2. Harris English is 3 and Tyrrell Hatton's 4. And neither one of them played with each other. None of them. They were not in the same group. Your GPP winning lineup, by the way, did actually pair up golfers. So obviously a guy won $25,000 doing that. He paired up Harris English and Corey Connors from the same group. That was really the only difference. Instead of Tyrrell Hatton, he basically went to Harris English. Not that you would make that switch, but you can see Harris English and Corey Connors were in group 7. Adam Scott was in group 6. Xander Schauffele was in group 3. And he also had Sung J M down here in group 9. So he had 5 golfers from the Marquee Tee Times, by the way. 5. Still weren't in the optimal lineup. We're always chasing the optimal lineup. So again, the Sweet Spot process prevails. Everything that I talk about, it was 100% correct this week. So now that you have that information, we can get on to the next part of the preview video. Obviously, this will be the end of the segment for the review of the Wells Fargo Championship.